This is the third part of a series that discusses the Spanish Civil War. If you wish to watch the previous videos, the links for them are in the description below. Now that the generals had made up their minds on hating the Republic, the go-ahead was given to begin the coup d'etat on the 17th of July. It would begin in the Spanish territory of Melilla in Morocco, where later that evening the generals would take the colony as quickly as possible. From there, the plan would be to capture the rest of the country by having local garrisons in the Falange and each of the provinces to overthrow the Republican authorities within the area. This is arguably the most important point in the entire war, because within less than 48 hours the territories controlled by each side would be determined. First, things seemed to go off without a hitch. Early on in the 18th of July, General Emilio Mola used the Army of Africa, a Moroccan mercenary group, and the Foreign Legion, a paramilitary organization, to crush the local Republican authorities. This was achieved with ruthless efficiency, as the paramilitary set about arresting any public officials and executing any who gave resistance. This was also true with the trade unionists in the area, who, when having learnt of the conspiracy, declared a general strike, but these were rounded up and shot. At dawn, the local government surrendered when they were threatened to be shelled with artillery. Meanwhile, the government in Madrid wasn't really taking things all that seriously, despite learning that the coup was happening a day before. Now, this lack of action was mostly due to many officials dismissing the threat as just a random uprising that wasn't even occurring on the mainland. There was also a great deal of hesitancy to arm the only people that could be trusted to stop the rising, that being the communist and anarchist militias. Now, in a military coup, if there is one institution that you cannot trust, it is, well, the military. This means that to survive, the Republic would have to rely on other sources of power to stop the rising, and it just so happened to have a good set of organizations that could do this, that being leftist militants. However, these needed to at first be armed, which would effectively mean giving them all the power to overthrow them, creating a tricky dilemma for the administration. In a time of crisis where quick decisions are critical, this indecisiveness would prove fatal for many. The Spanish state up until this point was hardly that united, and a lot of authority was held in individual provincial governments, which would mean the uprising would have to seize the country city by city, province by province. It would ultimately be up to the provincial governments to make their own individual response, which would dictate whether or not the region would fall into military hands. An entirely different story would play out in each city over the coming day as the struggle for power ensued. In Andalusia, things were rather touch and go. The army leader there had to be arrested when he refused to join the uprising, along with the police chiefs who were executed. The city of Seville was captured by a force of 4,000 troops, and the governors surrendered when threatened to be shelled with artillery, just as in Melilla. The coastal city of Cadiz was captured when again artillery was brought to the rising. Bit of a pattern here. Algeciras was also captured. The rebels were particularly vicious towards resistance in these areas, with phalanges rounding up suspected anarchists and socialists and bayoneting them. However, luck for the uprising in Andalusia wouldn't exactly continue. In Malaga, the civil guard refused to take part in the uprising and fought the local garrison, and were forced to retreat back to the barracks, which allowed trade unionists enough time to gather arms and secure vital points. In Almeria, the rebels were able to take up the city with little resistance, as the governor refused to arm the militias. However, they were forced to surrender when the navy, which had remained loyal to the Republic, threatened to blow them away. In Jaén, the civil governor ordered the civil guard to give their weapons to the anarchist militias, which defended the city. Up in the far north, things did not look very promising for the uprising. The troops in Santander refused to rise, and the city was secured with no bloodshed. Gijón was secured when the uprising was confronted by dock workers and driven out. In Oviedo, which had been the center of the 1934 revolution, the workers used their experience and courage to besiege the rebels when they captured the city. Bilbao, which was a Basque nationalist stronghold, the local leaders, who were, while conservative, preferred anything to an authoritarian Spain and were able to set up a defense, and local soldiers were arrested. San Sebastian had many right-wingers, and the uprising there was strong, but they were unable to contend with a ferocious attack by local trade unionists. The army was able to capture Vitoria, however, and Pamplona was a conservative Carlist stronghold, so that went to the coup without much fighting. The province of Castile was where the conspirators saw the most success. Burgos had a strong conservative culture and was pretty much handed over to the rebels without a fight. Valladolid surrendered when the governor was arrested by the assault guard, and the socialist militias, while they fought with bravery, were massacred. Because Valladolid was the provincial capital, the rebels were able to seize the rest of Castile, capturing the rest of the urban centres in rapid succession. The Balearic and Canary Islands were both quickly secured, as these were strongholds for the generals who plotted the coup. These territories would see little fighting during the Civil War. Meanwhile, in Galicia, fierce fighting broke out between the nationalists and the anarchists in Ferrol. However, the anarchists were unarmed and cleared away. The rest of Galicia fell to the rebels with a bit of delay. However, the hesitation on the governor's part allowed the rebels enough time to rest and defeat the socialist militias, which had not been equipped by the authorities by the 20th of July. Things went poorly for the plotters in the east. The rising in Valencia was slow and disorganized, and their barracks were besieged by leftist militias, while Castilla-La Mancha was secured because the rising there was simply too weak. The northeast was the region that arguably saw the most violence. The rebels had gathered a strong and willing force in Barcelona. However, because this was an anarchist stronghold, the CNT was swift to declare a general strike, and in no time at all, the city became a mess of brutal street fighting. The Unions were eventually able to secure the city for the Republic after a clash that killed in excess of 500 people. The anarchists then organized an army of 30,000 to retake surrounding areas in more fighting, indiscriminately shooting anyone who they suspected of being right-wingers. While this was marginally successful, they were not able to retake Zaragoza, which had fallen into rebel hands. Finally, there is the chaotic case of Madrid. The national government had refused to hand out weapons to local militias, ordering anyone who did to be shot. The situation in the capital had been tense and chaotic the entire time, with massive suspicion coming from the Popular Front of treason by the Liberals. The CNT declared a strike, and large demonstrations followed, crowding the streets. This put on so much pressure that on the 18th the government collapsed. Taking matters into their own hands, the anarchists seized weapons from the police and the assault guard and proceeded to occupy the streets, decorating the city with leftist insignia. When the coup got to Madrid, it was disorganized and lacked clear leadership. Shooting began to occur in the rebel loyalists sporadically, but the rebels were overwhelmed and driven away from their objectives. Madrid would remain under Republican control. Given the failure to capture the entire country, the plotters planned to ferry the army they had assembled in Melilla to the mainland by sea. This, they hoped, would allow them to capture any cities not under their control and to establish regions that they did. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be that simple, as it relied upon control of the navy, which had remained loyal to the Republic. Whilst there had been a power struggle amongst the sailors, the loyalists were able to thwart the rebels on their ships and were now taking orders from Madrid, the first of which was to blockade Melilla, preventing the rebels from getting to the mainland. For a moment, it seemed like the uprising was done for, as the strongest force lay stranded. However, not all hope was lost, as the generals had one last ace up their sleeve. The first airlift in human history was performed on 19th of July 1936 by the rebel military forces in Melilla. Within a day, they were able to transport troops and leaders, including Franco, through the sky without being stopped. A major success. Where did they get the planes from, you might ask? Well, they were provided by none other than Hitler and Mussolini, who had already developed deep sympathies for the uprising and were willing to lend them equipment. They also parked a couple of battleships in the region, which made the Navy hesitate to fire on the troops that would leave by sea later on. The blockade eventually retreated, allowing the rebels to cross. However, by this point the generals realized that they wouldn't be able to take the entire country, so instead they focused on using the Army of Africa to gain territory around the southern cities in the grasp. The paramilitary legion proceeded to roam around Andalusia, killing with impunity and terrorizing the countryside. Suspected leftists were quickly dealt with in macabre fashion. By the end of July, it dawned on the nation that they were facing total civil war, as front lines on either side had been developed, with the rebels in the west and the loyalists in the east. The rebels had captured over a third of Spanish territory, and quickly established themselves as the nationalists and began mobilizing for the fight that lay ahead. Their only difficulty now would be the consolidation of power and gaining leadership. The nationalists obviously wanted a centralized, authoritarian dictatorship to lead them. However, they had difficulties choosing their man. At first, they wanted General Sanjurjo, who, as some of you may find familiar, was the man who led the failed military coup of 1932 and was exiled to Portugal. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash on his way back to Spain. This crisis of leadership was solved, however, when General Franco arrived from the Canary Islands. At first, he was reluctant to become the leader, but he had many supporters, and with a combination of familial connections and Machiavellian tactics, his political rivals conceded to his authority. This happened as nationalist Spain was rapidly forging itself. The three main groups that constituted their ranks were the Carlists, who were the monarchist religious order that existed since the 1830s, the Alfonsists, monarchists who supported the reign of the last king, and more importantly, the Phalangists, who were the fascists who modeled themselves after the Italian fascist model. While these groups had their disagreements with each other, they would eventually be consolidated by Franco. The nationalist zone quickly became a totalitarian and repressive regime with a permeation of militaristic duty on every level, as all able-bodied male citizens were pressured to join the army and retake Spain. The church possessed a considerable amount of newfound power, as Catholicism became intertwined with the state and religious freedom was abolished. Repression of dissent was absolutely rampant. The first people the nationalists killed were trade unionists and Republican officials, who were shot on the spot, but then began a series of purges to weed out subversive elements. Many of the provinces that had been recently taken still had strong Republican support, and to correct this, the nationalists gathered lists of individuals and proceeded to round them up and kill them by any means necessary. It is estimated that anywhere from 80,000 to 200,000 people were slaughtered by the White Terror, as it was known. Meanwhile, the Republican zone was trying to deal with the sudden shock of violence. People had lost all faith in the Liberal government and the Republic, and far-left organizations seized the opportunity to take control and form revolutionary organizations. Like the Nationalists, the Republicans had support of various political groups, but these were far more divided. The C&T, or the Libertarian Leftists, had very different revolutionary ambitions to the Communists led by the UGT, and relations between these two were icy at the best of times. This was not even touching on the people of the Basque regions, who had only joined the Republicans because of their separatism, but while still being socially conservative, which many leftists found intolerable. These divisions made the Republic a fragile and disorganized clusterfudge which would have dire consequences later on. Repression and executions also occurred within the Republican zone in the form of the Red Terror, most infamously the killing of priests and the destruction of churches as anti-clericalism had reached its peak. Over 6,000 religious individuals were shot in the summer of that year. Leftist organizations also set up investigation commissions in order to weed out nationalist sympathizers. Many of the killings that were made were completely arbitrary and had no trial. Workers within the Republic also began a pattern of murdering their employers and landlords so that they could easily get away with the crime. It is estimated that a total of 38,000 people were slaughtered by the Red Terror. With no peace in sight, both sides steeled themselves for the clash that would determine the fate of Spain.